Is Bible study a science? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Channel summary of the Summa Theologica. Today we're talking about the first part, first question, Article 2, whether sacred doctrine is a science. Before we actually look at the question, we should note that when Thomas Aquinas says sacred doctrine, what he means is what you get from the Bible. So conclusions we get from understanding correctly and from reasoning, starting with the information that God gives us in the Bible. Is that a science? I should also note that by the word science, he doesn't mean something that uses the scientific method necessarily. By science, he just means a branch of knowledge that you acquire the knowledge methodically and it has one unified subject. So the question here isn't really, does the Bible use the scientific method? Really, the question is, does study of the Bible produce knowledge or just produce faith? And Aquinas' position is that it is a science, in fact. It is a body of knowledge. So to state his position, he quotes Augustine on the Trinity. To this science alone belongs that whereby saving faith is begotten, nourished, protected, and strengthened. He reasons that the only thing that this passage could be about is about sacred doctrine, because sacred doctrine is all about salvation, right? That's the only thing we have about salvation. And of course, in the passage, it's labeled a science, therefore sacred doctrine must be a science. So let's look at his argument for why this must be the case. Premise 1, proceeding from a principle known by the natural light of intelligence is a science. That's one kind of science, I should say. So sciences like this are like arithmetic and geometry. They start off with principles that are known by the light of reason alone, and they go from there. However, premise 2, proceeding from principles known by the light of a higher science is also a kind of a science. So this would be things like optics and music. Optics proceeds by geometry. Optics doesn't study geometry. Or musicians begin with arithmetic. They don't begin by studying arithmetic. They assume arithmetic in order to do the music. And the idea is here, premise 3, sacred doctrine proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely the science, he says, the science of God and the blessed. In other words, by that he means the principles that we get from the Bible that are revealed from God. So the basic idea is this: the guy that studies optics does not study geometry, right? The geometrician studies geometry, and the geometrician knows the principles of geometry and gives them to the optics scientist. And now the optics scientist takes that and gets new information from that, and we call that knowledge. And then we say what that person is doing, since they're doing it in a methodical way, we call that a science. Well, in the same way, the sacred doctrine theologian here doesn't know these articles of faith directly, right? The sacred doctrine theologian is getting them from somebody who does know it, though, namely God. So God gives these different articles of faith, and from those articles of faith, the sacred doctrine theologian goes on to deduce new bits of information, and just like the optics guy will call that knowledge, and just like the optics guy, he or she went methodically to get that knowledge, so we'll call this a science, and that's his argument. Now let's check out the objections. Objection 1, every science proceeds from self-evident principles. So look at that premise 1, right? Every science proceeds from self-evident principles. Remember his argument? We'll come back to that. Premise 2, sacred doctrine proceeds from articles of faith. In other words, not self-evident principles, because premise 3, the truth of articles of faith is not admitted by all. So they're not so they're not self-evident. And why are they not? Why believe that they're not admitted by all? 2 Thessalonians 3:2, for all men have not faith. You don't really need to quote the Bible to know that. Not everybody believes. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a science. Since the argument goes, since science starts off by these self-evident principles and, the articles of faith are not self-evident principles, this can't be a science. And hopefully from his argument, you can garner what his reply is going to be. His reply is going to be, premise one has got to be rejected, right? There are two kinds of sciences. There's that one that starts off with those self-evident first principles. And there's another one that starts off with principles that you got from a different science. And that's the kind of thing that sacred doctrine does. Objection 2, no science deals with individual facts. So, for example, like biology studies human digestion. It doesn't study like Bob's digestion specifically, right? It's just human digestion in general. 2, sacred science treats of individual facts. So like in the Bible, we're talking about stuff like the deeds of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob specifically, those guys, right? Not the deeds of humans in general. So sacred doctrine is not a science. His reply to this is that sacred doctrine doesn't deal with individual facts because it's concerned with them in principally, right? Like that's not the main concern and why they bring them up. Sacred doctrine deals with individual facts for 2 reasons. Number 1, as examples to be followed in our lives, as in like the moral sciences. So, and we could use a different example. So a biologist, I don't know if you ever heard that, this is just off the top of my head, I'm remembering that experiment. Somebody got shot in the stomach in Civil War era, and some other scientist like tied a piece of ham, I think, to a string and was dipping it into the hole in the stomach and seeing that the stomach acid was burning off the ham, and that was supposed to show that, what the stomach does in digestion. The person who is doing that experiment is not studying that specific person as a person, but as an example of what all humans would do. So in the same way, we might study specifically Jacob or Isaac or Abraham to get the idea of what everybody should do morally. Or the second reason would be to establish the divine authority of the authors. In other words, to establish that the people who wrote this book were inspired by God. And this could be something like if a scientist were to point to a specific experiment to establish the authority of some claim that he or she was making, like the experiment with the hole in the gut. But again, what makes something a science is that it's a unified body of knowledge with a unified subject, right? And Aquinas believes that the subject of sacred doctrine is God, that all this stuff is eventually about God. Even if we have, the deeds of individual people that are supposed to be our examples for moral examples, well, that's like to help us to live towards God. And the divine authority examples are to help us to believe that God is the one who told us these things. So ultimately, these individual things don't count against this being a science any more than pointing to that one experiment counts against biology being a science. That's all I got for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one. Adios.